Hello, fellow thinkers. Our second podcast is going to be about nihilism as we promised last week. So let's get to it, shall we? Hello, Brandon. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing fine as well. Just fine. So let's start by defining nihilism, shall we?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So nihilism, the textbook definition of nihilism is the rejection of all religious and moral principles in the belief that life is basically meaningless.
So,
So, Brandon, may I ask, what is your own personal definition of
yeah.
nihilism?
So I think that's a great definition of nihilism in the way it's colloquially used. But I think in this discussion, which is about like philosophy, we want to kind of narrow it down more. And
Yeah,
in in philosophy, in nihilism towards any subject is the belief that is the total negation of that subject. For example, mereological nihilism, and mereology is the study of composite objects. Mereological nihilism says that there are no composite objects. So
yeah,
then moral nihilism would be morals do not exist. Like metaphysical nihilism, I don't even know if that is a that wouldn't make sense, but like if it did, it would be that metaphysics just doesn't exist. Like it's basically ideas like that. So then to start the discussion, I wanna um I wanna like start by discussing who are the major nihilistic philosophers. The big ones that have been present throughout history are, in terms of their impact, not everybody might know their names, but Max Stirner, he's a big one.
yeah. Friedrich Nietzsche, Heidegger.
Nietzsche wasn't actually a nihilist, but his views on nihilism were very
That's an argument,
interesting.
though. I read like in some sources it says that he was a nihilist, but in others it says that he advocated and he kind of explained what nihilism was, but he did not actually believe in it.
Yeah, I've read Nietzsche, and he was I this is something that I wanted to clear up. People have been suggesting that he was a nihilist, but like nihilism is the word he would use to insult people. Like if he hated something, it was because it was nihilistic.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, I think for me, nihilism is not very good because I believe that everyone has a purpose in life, and that's why we work on our goals and we work hard as like hell in order to achieve those goals. And there's a purpose to it, I think. But that's just me. Another like I read a lot of Russian literature, and Nikolai, I think it was Chernshevsky, I think, yeah, he was also a nihilistic kind of philosopher, but I think he was also socialist. Uh, but I don't know. He was his from what I read, he was kind of good, but I don't know much about him. So,
So
Brandon, what is a nihilistic philosopher according to you?
so
So,
a nihilistic philosopher is any philosopher who adapts in a position of like a total negation of any subject. So, a case study in this, I think, would be Max Stirner. And he's a
mhm.
philosopher. He didn't write that many books, but I've read Stirner, and in his books, one of his ideas that are like very important are spooks. And a spook is basically any social construct that like binds humans to its will and kind of like makes us not free. Okay? And in Max Stirner's view, morality was one of these spooks. And so he completely negated morality in his works. So that makes him like a moral or meta-ethical or whatever nihilist. And his position that like morality, like family, religion, that they're all spooks that should be like that should be dissolved with extreme prejudice. That's a very extreme view, but I think it's very interesting to explore, at least.
For sure, for sure. I mean, I can see his point. So, I mean, it kind of makes sense if you look at it in a certain perspective. But you have to keep in mind that you have to keep in mind the perspective of like others on this issue. Um, I mean, it's truly we still like don't know consciousness. I think that also plays a part in it. I think because why are we conscious? You know,
Yeah.
that's like a religious concept also, and
Yeah, so
interesting subjects to talk about.
yeah, so an interesting point on this about religion is it connects to Nietzsche. So Nietzsche was very critical of Christianity in his work. He wrote a book called The Antichrist, and it's basically talking about Christianity in that book. And one of his main ideas in that book is that Christianity is nihilistic, meaning that it negates life through like anti-life beliefs and anti-life practices. And he thought that in order for like a Western, in order for civilization basically to kind of he saw a big threat in nihilism because he thought it was very destructive and
Hmm.
anti-life. And so he thought that that civilization basically would have to like overcome nihilism. And he viewed Christianity as like bad because of some of the views that he perceived in it he thought were anti-life and anti-Ubermensch, I guess.
You brought a good point there with Ubermensch. So I feel like the idea of Ubermensch also ties into this because Ubermensch, well, there are two kinds of Ubermensch ideals. You know, one of them is like the Nazis also adopted the Ubermensch ideal. One of them is like this belief that certain, you know, Teutonic, German, Prussian, and most importantly, Aryan people were superior. And the second one, which I think Nietzsche originally meant, was that discipline in one's life is um, important for, you know, for becoming an individual, kind of,
Yeah.
that is fit to serve in a society. And this ties into nihilism because, well, would you really like to become an Ubermensch, or what does it mean to be an Ubermensch if life is meaningless?
Well, so this is another thing. This is so Albert Camus was what you might call an existential nihilist. He thought that life in itself was meaningless, but we give it meaning through our actions.
Mhm.
And so we shouldn't all just like mope around all day, because our actions give it meaning. One of the phrases he coined was that existence precedes essence. And essence is traditionally thought to be like what is a being. But for Albert Camus, humans exist and then we define ourselves, including our purpose through our actions. And because he believed that there was no real meaning to life, but he didn't agree with the people who thought, oh, well then we should just mope around all day and kill ourselves. He didn't agree with them and he sought his own like path on that, and he was actually very influential.
So you're saying that this is kind. I've never read him or read about him at all, but I think what he's kind of also an existentialist philosopher. Am I getting that right?
Yes,
Because of
yes,
his
definitely.
political, or not political. I mean, his thinking. Um, yeah, that might be the case. Existentialism is a very, very interesting topic, and I love to talk about existentialism. So existentialism in its basic is believing that humans are responsible for their own actions. They have free will and that they could choose. And like many, if you look at many existentialist paintings or many existentialist philosophers talk about the idea of an apple. And as you may know, apple eating a sacred apple was the reason that Adam and Eve was cast away from heaven in many religions. So that kind of shows that humans, their choices kind of affect their root in life, and that is kind of like one of the main arguments against religion, but it also ties into the idea of nihilism, because if life is meaningless, then why do we need to have a choice? Is it only to bring pleasure to ourselves? That makes me ask that question. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's I haven't really like heard of that critique of religion before, but that actually sounds really like
I mean, that's what I think. I read about existentialism like a lot of times, and it's very, very interesting. It's like a loophole you just get in
yeah.
it, and then you can't get out. It's very interesting. I
So
suggest everyone reads at least one existentialist book in their life. But I think that humans definitely, it basically argues that like humans and their free will um, is the reason that they make these choices. It's kind of like anti-fatalistic approach to like many problems in society, but I think it's a good choice anyhow. It's individualistic in the fact that you must improve yourself.
yeah, so then another point of discussion about nihilism that I wanted to bring up is aside from it in like a meaning of life sense or a moral sense, there's also existentialism in other senses. And what would you think about like there's nihilism in other senses. Like, what would you think about ideas like mereological nihilism? You might not have done much research into it because it's not that like popular of a subject, I guess. But it's the idea that like only like fundamental like things exist. Composite objects don't exist. It's only like the tiny itty bitty things.
So, um, mereological. I think, is it also like called compositional nihilism? I think
Uh,
I read it under that title, but so doesn't it? I read like a short article on it. Doesn't like argue that we're kind of like undone, and then like we have parts scattered like around us, and then we need to like kind of piece them together. I'm not very sure about mereological nihilism. I haven't read it, so that's all I know. But in the topic of nihilism for me is interesting in that it's so radical in its way of thinking, because we like to think that our actions have consequences, but at the same time are part of us. And this is what kind of affects our future and the future of those around us. So I think the radical aspect of nihilism is what is interesting to many people. Don't you agree?
Yeah, like what you said about how like these actions affect our future is very like important to think about because you might not like think about this, but say that some like crazy moral philosophy that nobody has, that maybe only a few people have ever even considered is right. And like imagine we're all doing something like completely immoral by just like being regular people. Imagine. And then imagine like we all burn in hell for like centuries, right? Like even though that's probably not true, the way like morality, especially in my opinion, seems to be like an open question is really like concerning actually because of
Here you brought a good point. So, um, what I think about, so you're talking about an idea of a purgatory for the sins that we have committed. That's a really good point, because you see, um, how how do we determine what are sins and what are not sins?
so
That's the point of nihilism. I think that's where it kind of like that's where it shines.
yeah, so
Don't you agree?
I wanna go into this point more because so this is talking about different kinds of let me look at my notes, but this is talking about different kinds of like meta-ethical theories and it's moral skepticism, which and specifically epistemological moral skepticism. And that's the idea that like it's impossible to know this like the truth of a moral statement.
Certainly, certainly. I was watching. Um, I recently read Romeo and Juliet. An older book, and I've also you know read about so many ancient civilizations, like the Aztec civilization, the Mayan, and they actually used to sacrifice people for their gods, and that was seen as like a morally perfect thing to do, because I'm sacrificing my own sister, my own family members, my own people for my god. Like, that's the biggest thing, that's the best thing. Now, not so much, not so much. Times have changed, and so have we. um that's the basis of human nature,
Yeah,
change.
that brings
And
up that brings up a really important point, which is that like when people do horrible things, most of the time they think they're doing the right thing. Most of
yeah,
the time.
um
And that's really scary when you think about it.
yeah, of course it's scary, but in a way you need to believe in something in order to keep yourself going. Don't you agree? For um if that's how each side. I saw this. I saw this cartoon a few weeks back. It was telling like our glorious leader, their barbaric, evil leader, our our civilized and wonderful people versus their barbaric, evil, and ugly people. It's like, and their soldiers are just raiders and pillagers and barbaric people. I've said barbaric a lot, but that has a point actually. Well, our soldiers are wonderful, heroic, Great. And the reason that I've said barbaric, the word barbaric a lot, is that how do you define how do you define someone as, you know, society, like how do you define their society as so like not civilized that they're barbaric people? How do you do that? For you, from your perspective, it seems that their way of living is totally unacceptable. While your way of living is perfectly fine, wonderful. And that's just another point to add to the argument that we don't, morality and our morals change over time. You know, years ago it was maybe in the Wild West.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could kill a man and you could get away with it. And but now, you know, you can't. Our laws changed, our history changed. And you know, that's I think another thing to mention about nihilism.
Yeah, an interesting thing is that like the you have to have like an ethical system in order to judge like who's good, who's bad, who's barbaric, who's not, obviously. And but the challenge of finding one is gigantic because this is something called the grounding problem or the foundation problem for ethics. Because you have to find a foundation for ethics in order for it not to just be a complete open question. Now, this means that like if I ask you like why is killing wrong and you say like because like life matters and then I ask you why and then you say something else and then I ask you why, you have to end up somewhere in the like in the chain of questions. You have to end up somewhere that's like grounded in itself. But the
Yeah,
problem of finding that is like hugely influential to philosophers for like a very long time.
yeah. I have two things to mention here. When you said like the grounding problem, that's basically like saying, where do we start? Like, where do we draw the line that this action is totally morally uncivilized, bad, evil, and this action is accepted in like 99% of the countries, but or cultures, and just 1% of them say it's okay. How do you draw that? And that's a problem, and it's still not solved. Uh, and the second thing that you mentioned uh, that was very good was how you said that you know, people change over time, and their kind of way of thinking changes with them. And uh, that's, I think, the basis of education. The reason that we are getting educated is so that we change over time. If you don't believe in education, you basically don't believe in change. You know,
Yeah.
that's the reality.
Yeah. So one of the major influencers of like, ah, here's the thing. One of the major influencers of moral nihilism was David Hume, but he wasn't like a moral nihilist himself. But he was an Enlightenment philosopher. He was from Scotland, I think, and he had a
Yeah,
few ideas that were like influential. One of these was what I said earlier about like the idea of an open question. And then that idea of an open question in morality like gave rise to the grounding problem or the foundation problem, right? Like where do you start? And then he also had a really influential idea called Hume's guillotine. And this is like popularly known as the is-ought boundary, I guess. His idea was, how do you go from an is statement to an ought statement? So Brandon killed Nur to Brandon ought to not kill Nur. How do you get from that? That was one of his like really influential ideas, that there was a
Yeah.
divide between descriptive, meaning stuff that describes the world, and normative, stuff that like prescribes the universe.
So Brandon, while we are talking about this, I think it'd be good to mention naturalism. Uh, do you know what naturalism is?
No, what's naturalism?
Naturalism is like the belief that like every everything in this universe arises like comes from natural properties and causes. But there is a problem here. Certain philosophers do not like to include the idea of God in this, while others like to include it and say that, oh, this is the reason why we have nature, and that this is nature is the reason, or the universe is the reason that we have all this. So what do you think about that and nihilism at the same time? Because David Hume also talked about naturalism.
Yeah, so for naturalism, could you name other, first of all, could you name other naturalistic philosophers besides David Hume?
Naturalism. Well, I had only read David Hume, naturalism. Um, well, let me think about it. Mm, philosopher. Well, who was there? I think
So,
it was a guy by the name of Papineau, David Papineau. Maybe you know him. Uh,
I think I understand it more. I think I understand.
and I think we talked in our podcast last week, John McDowell. So those were the two people that I heard naturalism from, but I haven't read their ideas on it. I have simply read David Hume's version of it, so I don't want to give any false information about them. But overall, what I'm trying to get here is that naturalism and naturalism, I believe, affects nihilism in the sense that, in the end, nature is what drives people to do something. Natural desires, natural rights, natural limits. We have limits on us, you know. Uh,
Well,
we are not perfect beings, and that is how I believe how I believe it connects to nihilism, because nihilism is practically the belief that life is meaningless. While on the other hand, you're saying that nature drives us to do this in the name of, and then you leave it blank and you say it's either God or the universe or like some other explanation that you have.
I think
David Hume, he explained it with the idea of God. So yeah, that was what I read from him.
okay. So for the point about naturalism and nihilism, I think there's a way to resolve the contradiction. Because when you're saying that nature, like you mentioned how we have like natural laws and natural rights. I think that if nature does not contain rights, nihilism and naturalism can like coexist. Because if nature does not contain rights, then nature itself would be nihilistic, right? So
Yeah, that's my point.
that is a path that I think some philosophers have actually taken. And David Hume, uh, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't he influence like science really well?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think he did also. He was he had this, like, I believe, skepticist view on science, which really was kind of was the factors that influenced, scientific development later on, and that's why he's very significant.
Yeah. I think that one of the, because there's another thing that's related to nihilism here, which is skepticism. And they used to be, for a while in Russia, they were the same thing. People would treat them as the same thing for not that long, but like when the term was used in for a few months, basically, they were treated as the same thing. And that's a meaningful thing to think about because like nihilism can come from skepticism. So then when you look at the works of some of like skeptical and nihilistic philosophers, it's important to see how like the skepticism would play out, you know?
Yeah, I haven't read Skepticism. Uh, from I just know it that David Hume kind of was like the father of it, quote unquote. Um, and that's all I know about skepticism. But I really love the point that you told us that skepticism was very important in developing the idea of like modern nihilism.
Yeah. Like there's one example of this is moral skepticism. And I think that like moral skepticism as well as other types of as well as other types of nihilism, they can lead to very like what would seem to be disastrous consequences. And that kind of outlines like the importance of our of this discussion, right? Because if it turns out that like they have a huge influence in the world, depending on how morality and how ethics actually work, that could be like pretty catastrophic, you know?
So wait, so you're saying here that skepticism and nihilism, if they're kind of like combined ideas of like if they're kind of combined ideas, they really make a person question the system that they're living in. Am I right?
Definitely. And
So, okay, so your point is, in a way, they're destructive ideologies or like philosophies.
it, the thing is, they haven't had like insane influence, but I think that they have I think more nihilism because a skeptic would also be skeptical of nihilism too. So I think it's
Mhm.
more nihilism. I kind of agree with Friedrich Nietzsche on this one. I think that like I agree almost completely with his view that we've got to get over it, you know? And I think that I don't know I don't know how long of a time frame I'm talking about, but over maybe the next few hundred years, like the events that are going to happen and the way history is going to like fold out is going to be very dependent on how we do that.
Yeah, I mean, but I think you also brought up a good point here when you said we need to have a reason for why we do things. I think it was Nietzsche who said that like the person who has a why to live can bear almost any how.
I
Yeah.
actually
Did you read that quote?
I have heard of that quote and yeah, I agree completely honestly with that quote because it shows like how driven people can be, you know? We're back. from our brief lagging intermission.
We're back, everyone. We're back, fellow philosophers. We're ready to philosophize even more.
Yeah. So as we come back from our brief intermission, I want to I want to bring up a topic. Yeah, I want to bring up a topic about like the interpretation of nihilism
Sure.
because throughout like nihilism is a very everybody has heard of it. Not that many people have like investigated that much into it.
Or understood it to that fact.
Yeah. But it's a very big like metaphorical target that this is what Nietzsche did. This is what people today do. That to attack someone, they call them nihilistic. He did it against he did it particularly against Paul the Apostle, but like Christianity, like in general too. But then
Paul
people,
the Apostle. Yeah,
yeah,
I read about him. He has a pretty interesting life history. He was a Greek who, I'm sorry, he was a Hebrew Jew who learned Greek in Antioch or Antalya, which is a city in Turkey, which I have visited many times. And to briefly summarize his story, so this guy is he hates Jesus in the beginning, but then one night he hates Jesus and Christians. One night he has a dream, and Jesus talks to him and cries, and that's basically his enlightenment point, and he goes on to spread Christianity all over.
yeah.
And
So
many of his letters became a part of the Bible, and so he's pretty significant.
yeah, so everybody watching, you should definitely read Antichrist by Nietzsche because it's very interesting. And one of the things that he says about Paul, I think this is a quote directly from it. What has been called evangel from that moment was actually the opposite of which Jesus had lived. Ill tidings, a disangel. It is false to the point of nonsense to find the mark of the Christian in a faith, for instance, in the faith in redemption through Christ. Only Christian practice, a life such as he who died on the cross, meaning Jesus, is Christian. So what this means is that Friedrich Nietzsche's view on Paul was that he was kind of the Antichrist, kind of.
Kind of.
Because Friedrich Nietzsche didn't he was an atheist. He didn't believe that like an actual Antichrist existed, but he thought that like if it did, Paul would be a good um,
Candidate.
candidate. And to explain, he thought that Paul introduced nihilism to Christianity because he thought Paul was the one who made it more about the afterlife than life, which is kind of the anti-life ideology that I was talking about earlier. Like after the crucifixion, he thinks that Paul kind of changed the message into what eventually it is today, because there was obviously many influential figures besides Paul, but he thinks that Paul played a huge role because he was alive at the time, right? And he thinks that yeah, he thinks that he was he thinks that Paul was kind of the opposite. He thinks that because of Paul, the only true Christian was Jesus, right? And that's a quote that you'll find on the front of all of the copies of the Antichrist because it's very like provocative. And Nietzsche was a very provocative guy.
Yeah, yeah. Um. So you're saying that Paul was the Antichrist. Um. probably the person who spread Christianity all over the world, and the reason that like 33 like 3.3 billion people are Christians today is because of Paul. Is that and because of him, but you're saying that while spreading Christianity, he kind of indoctrinated his own ideas of nihilism, which basically killed the original ideas of Christ.
Yeah, so let me explain more because this is a very complicated thing. So he thought, so there's two major religions he talks about in the Antichrist, which are Buddhism and Christianity, because he talked a lot about Buddhism in a bunch of his books. And one of the problems he found about them was decadence, right? And he thought that both Buddhism and Christianity were decadent religions, but he thought Buddhism was like slightly better because it was like Christianity is struggling against sin, and that's obviously a big focus in it. But Buddhism is struggling against suffering, which is more pro like human and pro like Ubermensch, you know?
Yeah.
And then, so if you've read Beyond Good and Evil, he thinks that Buddhism has kind of achieved that because it has gone past like the self-deceptive moral concepts that he thinks influenced Christianity. And how did this happen? He thinks that there are kind of there's like this. Okay, so now we have to get into like his historical analysis. So Christianity obviously came from Judaism, and like he thinks that the reason Christianity has survived and Judaism too has survived is because they have allied with decadent people. And this has obviously like promulgated decadence. And what does
So
this mean? Sorry, wait, what were you gonna say?
yeah, go on, go on.
Okay. So this means that okay. So like the one of the main themes in Christianity is a kind of rejection of this world in favor of the afterlife, right? And he
Yeah, the
thinks,
kingdom of Christ.
yeah, and he thinks that um the this is because of an instinct of resentment towards the world, which the only debate I think really would be whether it's like good or bad that that instinct appears. Like Christians think it's because like, the Bible and stuff. But so yeah, so then sorry, I got off track a little bit. So
So I have a question, Brandon.
yeah,
What do you think Nietzsche means here by decadence?
decadence is kind of like cowardice over peace and laziness and resignation. And then like he was influenced by Schopenhauer in this regard.
Oh, okay.
Do you know about him?
Yeah. And okay. So, so you're saying that according to Nietzsche, the idea of decadence is when we give up on life,
Yeah. And then
basically.
yeah,
That's basically the biggest argument there could be against nihilism, because then you're not saying that this life is meaningless. You're saying that there's a world out there for us to explore, live, experience. So you should get out there and also treat yourself to the best degree, work out. This is basically kind of like Stoic thought.
yeah, yeah,
Marcus Aurelius, he was a
yeah.
wonderful philosopher king. And uh, I think this also, um, so I was, while you were saying this, I was thinking about the idea of, philosophy and philosophizing is as an exercise, a brain exercise. So Plato, Plato and Aristotle, for that fact, wrote that, um, told many of their students to philosophize in their free time because it would allow their mind to wander off to worlds that they don't live in, but at the same time think about their own environment. And I think this is in a way just basically trying to improve yourself and thinking about those near you and believing that the world has a meaning, and that meaning is might be you, the reason there's a purpose that you're here. So improve yourself and try to find that purpose with philosophizing. Secondly, so the thing that you told about nihilism was the world that you live in, if you're a nihilist, is meaningless. No meaning means no purpose. So during Renaissance and uh, our my middle school history teacher, Mr. Humphreys, emphasized much on this. So Renaissance means rebirth. Rebirth in what? Interest in classical culture, classical era. So during this time, the people of Europe had to pay like fines to like their government, like taxes and like money to the church, tithes and everything. But what happened in the end was they kind of got this idea of rebirth and interest in things that you know very individualistic things, such as thinking about the stars and learning about them. um, I think that's the main argument that there could be against nihilism, that it's destructive in the fact that it poisons people's minds to stay put. Don't do anything, don't move because you don't have to, or do
Yeah,
whatever you like because, well, the world is meaningless.
I actually like agree completely with that. And this
And
is
I yes, go on.
this is kind of like to kind of connect this to what we were talking about earlier. The person who adopts that attitude is like the Untermensch, okay? The person who is the opposite of what Nietzsche thought we had to do to kind of overcome nihilism.
Yes. Welcome back again, fellow thinkers. Unfortunately, there was a problem with the connection. Uh, unfortunately, due to the latest fires and stuff, there is a lot of problems right now in our area. But anyway, so uh, we were about to conclude our message on how to improve yourself and why we should improve yourself. So finally, I wanted to just simply say that the reason that I believe, if I believe in consciousness and that I'm living in this world and that everyone around me is also conscious, if that is correct, if I believe in that, if I believe in that fact, in that case, it must mean that there shouldn't be any nihilistic thought, because if people before me gave up and did nothing absolutely for society, then I wouldn't be living here. And that's the reason that I should keep going. Go, go, go. Work hard as you can. Fight for everything that you need to have. Fight for your own individual natural rights, I think. So, Brandon, do you want to add any final things?
Yeah, just like kind of seek out your destiny. You want to blaze your own path. You don't want to be like a decadent and like lazy person. You don't want to kind of succumb to these nihilistic tendencies, you know?
That's the main message that we were trying to give. in this podcast. Of course, that's our own opinion, but we'll see in the future. So, anyways, everyone, anyways, fellow thinkers, we have concluded our podcast with a positive message to everyone. So we will be ending soon. We are planning to record our next podcast, next week on the usual time and release it on Sunday. So expect a new video then. And finally, next week, our topic will likely be on Greek philosophers. And then later on, we are planning to do a kind of like a series of podcasts on religion, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So we'll get to that. We'll keep you notified. Be sure to follow our Instagram. Please subscribe and be sure to have the notifications on. Okay, fellow thinkers. Goodbye.
Peace out.
Bye-bye.